Pour nous en parler, je vais tout de suite céder la parole au professeur Smith, professeur à Calvin College aux États-Unis, auteur de, on l'aura compris je pense, On the Road with Augustine, et tout récemment, How to Inhabit Time, comment habiter le temps, question évidemment éminemment augustinienne, on songe au livre 10, je crois, des Confessions. Saint-Augustin passeur, Saint-Augustin voyageur, c'est sur une forme particulière de chemin que va nous entraîner le professeur Smith, le sentier des contrebandiers. Augustin Smuggler, smuggler of the spirit, of the mind. We're so honored and pleased to hear you, professor.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
We don't have the budget for simultaneous translation. So we asked very kindly Professor Anya Bettenworth from the University of Cologne and Maurice Kuhn, a doctoral student from the University of Cologne, both specialists in Augustine, to help us with the translation between French and English. I know French and English, but I'm not a specialist of Augustine to understand the nuances. So it's better that they do them. If you can either, Tony, summarize, because you speak English too, summarize your talk, or maybe let Anya and Maurice summarize what you have said, and then do the same thing with Lawrence.
So we are, can you hear me? Is it on?
Is that better now?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, we're not sure if we can repeat everything of your presentation because there were so many rich details in it, and it's also kind of a chain translation because Maurice, he's fluent in French, I can understand French, I'm more fluent in English, so we are trying to do our best to convey what's being said. So the presentation, and Maurice corrects me if he finds more details that I missed, is the gist of it is that Saint Augustine is a multi-layered person that was perceived in European thought as being focused on sin and on moralism and on the repression of sexuality, and so he had a very gloomy and dark image in the European perception for a long time. But in reality, he himself wandered between various schools of thought. Like you had the Manichaeism at first, Neoplatonism before he joined Christianity. He had these various approaches to life, and so he's more multi-layered than the traditional image might make us think. And he also influenced a wide choice of scholars and philosophers. So you mentioned lots of names there. So one of the most important that also Catherine Conybeare mentions is it's Derrida with Sa Confessions, and yeah, but also many others. So there was, I think Montaigne was in it, right? Who else did you mention? Heidegger, yeah. So you get like philosophers who were occupied with St. Augustine, and Paul Royal, of course, also. Not for nothing, the presidents of the Friends of Paul Royal. So yeah, there is this long tradition, and he inspired many people from very different backgrounds, you have to say, in all the ages, from medieval to modern times.
I don't have to add other things.
I think it's clearer in English than in French. Thank you very much.
You just let me know if we missed something.
No, it's wonderful. Thank you very much.
C'est bon? Is it more? Thank you very much to our Tunisian hosts. It's been a really, I've been very glad to be here. And thank you both, glad to be part of this. Thanks for listening to me in English. Like most lazy Americans, I'm in awe of your multilingual skills. So I'm very interested in the reception of Augustine, like I think all of us here, both into European thought as well as into modernity. And that has been the focus of a lot of my work. I have, before this, focused on French and German philosophies, particularly from the 20th century, Heidegger, Derrida, Lyotard, a number of North African thinkers, in fact, who have been influenced by St. Augustine. What I'm doing in this paper is something new. I'm going back to the 19th century to an important philosopher named Hegel. Just for the students, in case we don't lose you entirely, Hegel wrote think of it as the very beginning of the 1800s, and was a very still influential philosopher who also importantly had influence on Karl Marx, which is important then for how Hegel gets received in French thought in the 20th century. So I think without further ado, I'm going to keep track of my time. I will not speak longer than 20 minutes. I don't think you should have to. Yeah, sure.
Ok, je vais vous traduire un peu l'introduction de James Smith. Ce qui l'intéresse en particulier, c'est la réception de Saint Augustin dans les œuvres philosophiques du XVIIIe siècle et du XIXe siècle, et aussi du XXe, tu as mentionné Heidegger aussi, oui. Et aujourd'hui, il va parler de la façon dont Hegel, le philosophe allemand, fait référence à Augustin dans son œuvre, ce qui est très important si j'ai bien compris, parce que Hegel a une forte influence sur la philosophie politique de Karl Marx.
In 1948, the Algerian writer Albert Camus, who wrote his dissertation on Neoplatonism and St. Augustine, reflected on what was perceived to be a dichotomy between Augustine and Hegel. And he described the dichotomy, the distinction, this way. He said, "We do not believe any longer in God, but we believe in history. For my part," Camus said, "I understand well the interest of the religious solution, and I perceive clearly the importance of history. But I do not believe in either one or the other in an absolute sense. I interrogate myself, and it annoys me very much that we are asked to choose between St. Augustine and Hegel. I have the impression," Camus said, "that there must be a supportable truth between the two." So we have this choice supposedly between Augustine and Hegel, and Camus, the North African, kind of refuses that choice, that dichotomy. Now, when it's framed in this way, Augustine and Hegel stand for two different accounts of meaning or significance, or two different ways of making sense of our experience, two different sources of hope, you might say. Either with Augustine, God, or with Hegel, allegedly, history. So this is really a story about modernity that some strains of the Enlightenment like to tell. That is, they tell a story. This is a certain Enlightenment narrative coming out of modernity, that we used to, in the past, place our hope in God, but now in our modern world, we trust history. We must choose between Augustine and Hegel. But to his credit, Camus refuses this distinction or dichotomy. He wants to live between Augustine and Hegel. But what I want to suggest this afternoon is that Camus too readily accepts the story about Hegel, That is, Camus accepts the notion that history in Hegel's philosophy is essentially naturalistic. It's just a merely immanent force in the world instead of God. That's a way of reading Hegel that Camus seems to accept. But I want to suggest that this is a fundamental misunderstanding of Hegel. In fact, I would argue that there is little, if any, room between Augustine and Hegel. Or perhaps better, as a modern extension of Augustinian intuitions, Hegel's philosophy represents the between that Camus might have been looking for, precisely because for Hegel, God's spirit is incarnate in history. So just for context, what I'm contesting, maybe you could just summarize this a little bit. Okay. But just what I'm going to say right now, if it's helpful. I don't know what we're doing right now, but when Camus sees this distinction between, as if he has to choose between Augustine and Hegel, it's experienced as a choice between God as a force in history, or just kind of history itself as an engine, which is sort of the communist Marxist story. What I'm going to argue is that that is actually not Hegel, and that Hegel is much more like an extension of Augustine.
D'accord. Professeur Smith part de la thèse selon laquelle, part d'une citation d'Albert Camus, qui a l'impression de devoir faire le choix entre Saint-Augustin, c'est-à-dire la religion, et Hegel, c'est-à-dire l'histoire d'une manière assez scientifique, et que c'est une vraie dichotomie, une fossé qu'on ne peut pas traverser. Et la thèse de cette de M. Smith sera que Hegel est une attendez, je suis désolé, que Hegel est une
il y a un malentendu sur Hegel, en fait. Un malentendu sur Hegel, et que selon le professeur Smith, il y a un lien entre Augustin et Hegel, et que Hegel représente justement cet entre-deux que Camus cherchait ailleurs.
Yeah.
That's it?
Yes. Merci. In fact, both Hegel and Augustine would also refuse this false dichotomy between an appeal to God or an appeal to history. To the contrary, both Hegel and Augustine see history as an arena of God's action, such that to read history is, we would say, apocalyptic. It unveils something about God's presence and purpose in time. More specifically, both Augustine and Hegel read history as a conduit, a channel of spirit's activity. Hegel's word in German here is Geist, which is usually translated spirit in English, in l'esprit? Yeah, in French. Both Augustine and Hegel operate on the basis of a conviction well articulated by a Latin American theologian named Gustavo Gutierrez, who says God's temple is human history. For both Augustine and Hegel, history itself is, we might say, a passeur, a smuggler, a passeur, a smuggler of the spirit. That is, history is like a sacramental mediator of divine presence and action. That's why both theology, say Augustine, I know that's not uncontroversial, and philosophy, Hegel, must take up history as a focus. History is a text to be read in order to understand what the Spirit is doing in time, in history. So there's an interesting question here of intellectual history, which is kind of a secondary concern, which is to demonstrate why Hegel's philosophy of history could be read as one of the most faithful extensions of Augustine's theology of history. And I just want to note here, not that probably anybody here cares, but this is a controversial matter for how to read Hegel. And Hegel has a long history of being read as if he was rejecting anything theological. And I just think that that is a terrible, terrible misreading of Hegel. And that, in fact, if you look closely at Hegel's philosophy of history, it lines up remarkably parallel to Augustine's own theology of providence. So, in that sense, Hegel would be one of the people who smuggles Augustine into modernity, or ferries Augustine into modernity, because Hegel's philosophy of history, which had then so much influence afterwards, actually has a lot of similarities and extension of Augustine's own theology of providence. This is another reason why I think we moderns are always more Augustinian than we realize, because we've inherited Augustinian ideas through these mediators like Camus or Derrida or Lyotard or Heidegger, and now I want to suggest Augustine. I think what I will do is, given the way our conversation is going this afternoon, I'm just going to summarize my paper and say a few words about it. I'll send you the paper and we can talk more about it. Does this sound okay? So first of all, Augustine talks a lot about providence. What is providence in French? Providence. Providence. Okay, well, so that's easy. In his book called City of God. And in City of God, which is a later work of Augustine's, what it means for Augustine to talk about providence, which is something like God's control of history, is not, it's very important. Augustine is not just making some general claim that God controls history. The sort of exercise that he is undertaking in City of God is to actually read, to interpret, if you will, specific historical events that are close to him and that are near to him, that his community is experiencing, to read those specific historical events to try to understand what God is doing. So it's not just God is in control, it's what is happening in this moment of the Roman Empire in which we find ourselves, and what does that tell us about God's intentions for the world. So for example, Augustine asked this question very near the beginning of City of God. Let us therefore proceed to inquire why God was willing that the Roman Empire should extend so widely and last so long. The exercise, he says, requires us to go on and to examine what moral qualities and for what reason the true God designed to help the Romans in the extension of their empire, for in his control are all the empires of the earth. So do you see, he's asking, what is happening? How is God using the Roman Empire to advance God's purposes? this is not the same as excusing or justifying everything that the Roman Empire did. This is not Augustine saying the Roman Empire is God's blessed by God. Do you know what I mean? Unlike, by the way, a lot of Americans do. Sorry. Instead, what he's saying, because in fact, Augustine thought the Roman Empire was fundamentally unjust, right, and could never be just because it never had true worship. So what interests me then is, again, I'll summarize quickly. Augustine reads the particularities of his historical moment in which he finds himself. He looks at the events of his day in order to discern, to see through, to recognize what God is doing in history. Because history now is an arena or a venue for God's revelation, for God to be revealed. And what's interesting is that if then you come to Hegel in the 1800s, particularly in his work called, sorry, were you one?
Yeah, maybe.
Okay.
Try to.
Sorry, just take one shot, a 2-sentence summary.
C'est vraiment très très difficile.
Yeah,
J'espère que tu
yes,
aussi, Gérard,
exactly,
qui a pris des notes pour rajouter quelque chose. Donc, il était question de la Cité de Dieu, une des dernières œuvres de Saint Augustin, dans lequel il pose la question de savoir si et dans quelle mesure Dieu agit dans l'histoire. Et ce qui est important, c'est le concept de la providence qu'établit Augustin dans ses œuvres, c'est-à-dire qu'il veut examiner, surtout au début de la Cité de Dieu, comment Dieu réussit à faire de l'histoire son œuvre.
Yeah.
Ouais, c'est à peu près ça. Ouais.
Yeah. C'est bien. Merci. So I'll just summarize. When you turn to Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of world history, you see, first of all, exactly this emphasis on what he calls discernment. Discernment en français. Discernement. Okay. That's Hegel ends his lectures on the philosophy of world history by talking about exactly discernment. And in fact, he puts it this way: it is spirit that bears witness to spirit, and in this way it is present to itself and free. What is important to discern is that spirit can find freedom and satisfaction only in history and the present, and that what is happening and what has happened does not just come from God, but is God's work. So when we are looking at what happens in history, we are actually trying to see, to discern what is God's work, what is Spirit's movement in human culture. And just as one example, for Hegel at that time, this was not primarily, but significantly a matter of reading, discerning what was happening in the French Revolution. So what was Spirit doing? What was God showing? What was God's Spirit accomplishing in human history in the event of the French Revolution? And for Hegel, that revealed that what Spirit wants is reconciliation and freedom. Spirit is all about the unveiling of freedom, which will eventually require reconciliation. What I find interesting, and I'm happy to distribute this paper to anyone who wants to read all the details and footnotes in English, since I'm just summarizing here so quickly. but for Hegel, what that means is when, let me put it this way, here's the gold. In St. Augustine, there is a very key teaching or doctrine, which in Latin we say is the notion of the totus Christus, the whole Christ, totus Christus. And what that was is Augustine's way of emphasizing that the body of Christ, which is how we would talk about the church, the body politic that is the church, the body of Christ was intimately and incarnately connected to the head, which is Christ, the head of the church. And so this picture that the social body that is the church is that intimately connected body that also is connected to Christ the head. I want to suggest that, in fact, Hegel's philosophy of history replays that, not just for the church, but for human culture and history. That if Augustine talks about the totus Christus as a way of expressing how intimately and incarnate God's presence in the body is, in a way, Hegel's philosophy of history is an analog to that, because for Hegel, what humans are doing in history is the incarnation of spirit, Geist, God, the world spirit, who is accomplishing something in history which is fundamentally freedom and reconciliation. So you get this really interesting kind of parallel, and in that sense, Hegel expresses a form of a philosophy of history that is much more Augustinian than we ever would have realized. To bring it back to North Africa, I think what becomes interesting then is I'm always interested in how much Camus is taken with St. Augustine, right? He never ever quite rejects St. Augustine, but he also never quite accepts St. Augustine. And I would say what you see in St. Augustine and Hegel in history is a notion of hope that probably is what stands most starkly in contrast to Camus. But that would be for a later conversation. That is my time up. So I will stop there. If anybody wants to take a shot at translating a little bit of it.
Après, il était question de Hegel, et professeur Smith vient de dire que Hegel partait du principe que l'esprit du monde, on peut dire l'esprit du monde, oui, l'esprit du monde avait deux objectifs principaux, et c'est la réconciliation et la liberté. Ouais. Et en même temps, il y a dans les œuvres de Saint Augustin, il y a ce concept du totus Christus, c'est-à-dire que l'Église, que le Christ est incarné dans l'Église, et que l'Église est fortement liée au Christ, que c'est que c'est inséparable. En même temps, chez Hegel, c'est l'esprit, oui, qui travaille dans le monde et qui unit tous les êtres humains. Oui, on peut dire ça. Comme ça, il y a vraiment une influence augustinienne dans la façon dont Hegel voit l'histoire. Est-ce que c'est bon?
Oui,
ouais.
moi c'est ça.
Merci.
Hegel, si j'ai bien compris, Hegel généralise la lecture augustinienne de l'histoire providentielle, qui concernait surtout l'Église, finalement, Hegel généralise la méthode et l'interprétation augustinienne à tous les aspects de l'histoire, y compris la Révolution française, où on va chercher ce que veut l'esprit dans la Révolution française, alors que finalement Augustin se contentait entre guillemets, de se demander ce que Dieu cherchait dans l'Empire romain. Mais finalement, la méthode est la même, et vraiment, je remercie énormément le professeur Smith d'insister sur ce point, parce qu'il faut voir que la plupart des spécialistes de Hegel considèrent que la philosophie commence avec Kant. Et la façon dont des gens comme Kant ou Hegel peuvent hériter de conceptions très anciennes est un point qui est complètement négligé par les spécialistes de la philosophie hegelienne, qui regardent du côté de Marx, qui regardent du côté de la modernité, mais qui ne sont pas du tout attentifs aux héritages de Hegel. Et cette grande familiarité entre la position augustinienne et la position hegelienne, qui nous frappe parce que nous sommes des lecteurs de la Cité de Dieu et que nous connaissons un tout petit peu la méthodologie, la méthode providentialiste de lecture de l'histoire d'Augustin, eh bien, elle ne frappe pas du tout les modernistes qui s'intéressent à Hegel. Donc je crois qu'on ne peut que souligner l'importance immense du travail que réalise le professeur Smith en rendant à Hegel ce qui lui appartient, c'est-à-dire sa dimension augustinienne, ou rendant à Augustin ce qui lui appartient, c'est-à-dire le principe d'une lecture providentielle et orientée de l'histoire d'une part, et de l'autre part l'idée que l'histoire est le lieu de lecture attentive, de micro-lectures qui doivent être rattachées à de grands mouvements, de grandes relations et une grande direction, on peut dire, du fil de l'histoire. Est-ce que c'est ça?
And could I just add then, if we wanted to explore how that got to Hegel, how Augustine came to Hegel, I do think part of the story is the Lutheran Reformation.
Oh.
So if you know, that's a different, but in a sense it is Hegel's early theological formation, which is influenced by Luther and the Reformation, Martin Luther OSA, Order of St. Augustine, who mediates, I think, those Augustinian ideas so that they're in the air for him. Yes, but the way you said it is brilliant. Yes.
Okay.
Merci. Merci.